there's a document in the archive that always unsettles me when I pull it from its folder. It's not a secret order or a dramatic manifesto, it's just a ballot paper. Ordinary voters, in an ordinary polling station, once used pieces of paper like this to help Adolf Hitler into power. Not by accident, not in a single moment, but step by step, as a wounded democracy slowly handed him the tools he needed to dismantle it. In this episode, let's walk through how that happened. Not as a distant inevitability, but as a chain of choices, crises, and miscalculations. Part 1. A defeated empire, a fragile republic. To understand Hitler's rise, we begin not with him, but with the world that shaped him. In 1918, the German Empire surrendered at the end of World War I. The army retreated, not from a battlefield disaster inside Germany, but from a war that had exhausted men, money, and morale. Millions were dead, and those who survived returned to a country in turmoil. The new Treaty of Versailles forced Germany to accept responsibility for the war, pay reparations, surrender territory, and limit its military. Many Germans saw these terms as a humiliation imposed by enemies abroad and traitors at home. From this wreckage, politicians proclaimed a new democratic system, the Weimar Republic. On paper, it was advanced proportional representation, universal male and later female suffrage, a Bill of Rights. But it was fragile for several reasons. It was born out of defeat, not victory. Many conservatives, monarchists, and military figures never accepted it. The far left saw it as a compromise with capitalism. The Constitution allowed the president to rule by emergency decree under Article 48, a safety valve that would later be abused. Street battles, paramilitary groups, political assassinations, hyperinflation, all of this marked the Republic's early years. Citizens who might have learned to trust democracy instead experienced it as chaos and humiliation. Into that atmosphere walked a former soldier, angry and restless, looking for meaning. Part 2. The Unknown Agitator. Adolf Hitler did not emerge from nowhere as a dictator. He started as an angry man in the back row of a small political meeting. In 1919, he joined the German Workers' Party, a tiny extremist group in Munich. He soon began speaking at their gatherings and discovered something crucial. He could hold a crowd. His ability to channel resentment, rage, and wounded pride into simple, emotional speeches made him stand out. Under his influence, the group renamed itself the National Socialist German Workers' Party, the NSDAP, or Nazi Party. He pushed 3 core ideas that would define the movement: a racist worldview centered on anti-Semitism, blaming Jews for Germany's defeat, economic problems, and cultural degeneration; a belief in national rebirth, that Germany had been great, had been betrayed, and could rise again through strong leadership; a hatred of both Marxism and liberal democracy, which he portrayed as tools of Jewish and foreign influence. He turned the party into more than a debating club. It became a movement. The Nazis founded a party newspaper, organized local branches, and created the SA, or Brown Shirts, street fighters who broke up opponents' meetings and battled communists in the streets. Already we see a pattern: propaganda, paramilitaries, and a promise of belonging. Part 3. The first attempt, the Beer Hall Putsch. In 1923, Germany lurched into crisis again. Hyperinflation destroyed savings almost overnight. French and Belgian troops occupied the Ruhr industrial region after Germany fell behind on reparations. Economic panic mixed with nationalist fury. In Bavaria, right-wing groups openly defied the central government. Hitler believed the time had come. On a November evening in Munich, he and his supporters stormed into a beer hall where Bavarian leaders were meeting, hoping to seize them and launch a march on Berlin, an imitation of Mussolini's march on Rome. This was the Beer Hall Putsch. It failed within a day. Police and army units stopped the march. 16 Nazis and 4 policemen were killed. Hitler was arrested and charged with treason. Yet the failed coup did not end his career. It transformed it. His trial gave him national publicity. He used the courtroom as a stage to pose as a patriotic defender of Germany. He received a relatively lenient sentence and served only part of it. In prison, he dictated Mein Kampf, laying out his ideology and long-term ambitions. Most importantly, he reached a strategic conclusion. Next time, power would be taken legally, not by storming a hall with guns, by winning votes, entering government, and then dismantling the system from within. Part 4. A Party in the Wilderness. Preparing. After the putsch, the Nazi Party was briefly banned. When Hitler was released from prison at the end of 1924, he set about rebuilding. He persuaded Bavarian authorities to lift the ban and reorganize the party on a national basis. Germany was divided into districts with Nazi leaders responsible for local recruitment, fundraising, and propaganda. But something else changed: the wider atmosphere. By the mid-1920s, under the Dawes Plan and new loans from the United States, the German economy stabilized. There were still serious problems, but the wild years of hyperinflation eased. The Weimar Republic seemed, for a time, to be finding its footing. During these golden years of relative stability, the mainstream Social Democrats and centrist parties held strong positions. Extremist parties, including the Nazis, shrank to the margins. In the 1928 elections, the Nazi Party won only a small fraction of the vote, about 2 to 3%, with just 12 seats in the Reichstag. The radical demagogue appeared for a moment to be going nowhere, but appearances can be deceiving. While their electoral strength waned, the Nazis used these years to build youth, women's, and professional groups, practice mass rallies, spectacle, and symbolism, hone the message: unity, strength, blame, and rebirth. They were laying rails in a landscape that, for the moment, seemed calm. Then the ground shook again. Part 5. The Great Depression. Crisis opens the door. In 1929, the Great Depression began in the United States and quickly spread worldwide. For Germany, which relied heavily on American loans, the impact was devastating. Banks failed, businesses collapsed, and unemployment climbed into the millions. By the early 1930s, roughly a third of the workforce was without a job. Despair and anger spread. The Weimar political system struggled to cope. Coalition governments collapsed. Presidents increasingly relied on emergency decrees instead of parliamentary majorities. Politics became polarized between the far left and far right. This was the environment the Nazis had been preparing for. They offered a clear story. Germany had been stabbed in the back in 1918, oppressed by Versailles and ruined by corrupt politicians and Jews. A clear enemy: communists, socialists, Jews, and November criminals. A clear promise: jobs, strength, national unity, and an end to the chaos of parliamentary squabbling. A clear leader: Hitler, portrayed as a man above party politics, embodying the German will. In the 1930 Reichstag elections, the Nazi vote share jumped dramatically. In 1932, they became the largest single party in the Reichstag, with around 37% of the vote in July. Not a majority, but enough to make Hitler impossible to ignore. It is important to remember, millions chose him. Many did so not because they wanted dictatorship or genocide, but because they were desperate for stability, jobs, and national pride, and because they believed, or chose to ignore, the violence and hatred already clear in his movement. Part 6. The Backroom Deal. Even as the Nazi vote surged, Hitler still did not have full power. Germany's political system was complex, and President Paul von Hindenburg, an aging war hero, held the authority to appoint chancellors. Hindenburg disliked Hitler and initially refused to make him head of government. For a time, other conservatives, men like Heinrich Brüning, Franz von Papen, and Kurt von Schleicher, tried to govern without him, relying on presidential decrees. But these governments were unstable. The economy remained in crisis. No one could build a lasting majority in the Reichstag. Behind the scenes, a group of conservative politicians and advisors, led by Franz von Papen, convinced Hindenburg that the only way forward was to bring Hitler into office, but under control. They assured the president that Hitler could be tamed by traditional elites. Conservatives in the cabinet would outnumber Nazis. They could use his popularity with the masses while keeping real power in responsible hands. On the 30th of January 1933, Hindenburg appointed Adolf Hitler as Chancellor of Germany, with Papen as Vice-Chancellor and only a few Nazi ministers in the cabinet. Many of these men believed they were using Hitler. In reality, they had unlocked the gate. Part 7. Fire, Fear, and the End of Civil Liberties. Once in office, Hitler moved quickly to transform his chancellorship into something far more powerful. On the night of the 27th of February 1933, the Reichstag building, home to the German parliament, caught fire. A young Dutch communist, Marinus van der Lubbe, was arrested at the scene. To this day, historians debate whether he acted alone or whether the Nazis had some role. What matters for our story is how the Nazis used the fire. Hitler and his allies blamed the blaze on a communist plot and presented it as the beginning of a leftist revolution. The very next day, they persuaded Hindenburg to sign an emergency decree, the Decree of the Reich President for the Protection of People and State, commonly known as the Reichstag Fire Decree. This decree suspended key civil liberties, including freedom of speech, press, assembly, privacy of post and telephone, and protections against arbitrary arrest and search. Allowed the government to arrest and detain people indefinitely without trial. Gave the central government power to intervene in state governments. In effect, it turned Weimar's emergency mechanism into a permanent state of exception. Thousands of communists, socialists, and other opponents were arrested. The first concentration camps, such as Dachau, were opened for political prisoners. Germany still technically had elections and a parliament. But the playing field was now tilted by fear and coercion. Part 8. The Enabling Act. Democracy votes itself away. With opposition harassed and intimidated, new elections were held on the 5th of March. In the year 1933, the Nazis increased their share of the vote, but still fell short of an absolute majority. Hitler's next step was to make the Reichstag irrelevant. He proposed a law called the Enabling Act, formally. The law to remedy the distress of the people and the Reich. This law would allow his cabinet to pass laws, including ones that violated the Constitution, without the Reichstag's approval or the president's signature. In other words, it would shift legislative power from parliament to the executive to Hitler and his ministers. To pass, the act required a two-thirds majority. The Nazis took several steps to ensure it. Communist deputies were arrested or prevented from taking their seats. Some social democratic deputies were jailed or had fled. The vote was held in a building surrounded and inside, lined, with SA and SS men. A clear signal of intimidation. Most conservative and centrist parties, including the influential Center Party, chose to support the bill, persuaded or pressured into believing it was temporary or necessary for stability. On the 23rd of March, 1933, with opposition voices reduced and many deputies voting under the shadow of intimidation, the Reichstag passed the Enabling Act. Legally, Germany remained a state with a constitution. In practice, parliamentary democracy had just voted itself out of meaningful existence. Part 9. Coordination, bringing everything into line. With legislative power in hand and civil liberties suspended, Hitler and the Nazi leadership embarked on a process they called Gleichschaltung, often translated as coordination or bringing into line. Over the next months and years, all other political parties were dissolved or banned. By mid-1933, the Nazi Party was the only legal party in Germany. Trade unions were destroyed and replaced with the Nazi labor organization. State governments were subordinated to central authority. Nazi Gauleiters became the real power in the regions. The press, radio, and cultural institutions were brought under tight control or censorship. Professional associations, from lawyers to teachers, were Nazified. Opponents were imprisoned, exiled, or terrorized into silence. A one-party dictatorship emerged, built under the appearance of legal measures and administrative reorganization. Even within the Nazi movement, Hitler did not tolerate rival centers of power. In 1934, during the Night of the Long Knives, he ordered the murder of leaders of the SA, including Ernst Röhm, along with other political opponents and personal enemies. This purge reassured the army and showed that Hitler was the ultimate authority. When President Hindenburg died on the 2nd of August 1934, Hitler merged the offices of President and Chancellor, taking the title of Führer and Reich Chancellor. With the army swearing an oath of personal loyalty to him, his control over the German state was effectively complete. What had begun as a chancellorship within a constitutional system had become a dictatorship, with the law itself turned into a weapon. Part 10. How did it happen? The threads together. If we step back from the timeline and look at the pattern, Hitler's rise was not a single event, but a weave of several threads. 1. Defeat and humiliation. World War I and the Treaty of Versailles left Germany bitter, economically strained, and politically unstable. Many citizens never accepted the legitimacy of the democratic experiment that followed. 2. Structural weaknesses in Weimar democracy. Proportional representation fragmented the party system. Article 48 allowed rule by decree. Elites remained hostile or lukewarm to democracy. These weaknesses did not doom the republic by themselves, but they made it vulnerable in crisis. 3. Economic disaster and fear. The Great Depression destroyed livelihoods and confidence. When people are frightened and desperate, they become more willing to listen to voices promising certainty, simple explanations, and strong authority. 4. Propaganda and scapegoats. The Nazis offered a narrative that explained everything through conspiracy and betrayal, especially blaming Jews and communists. They turned complex economic and social problems into moral dramas with clear villains and a promised heroic savior. 5. Violence and intimidation. The SA, and later the SS, created an atmosphere where political participation carried real physical risk. This violence was not random. It was a tool used to shape electoral outcomes and silence dissent. 6. The miscalculation of elites. Conservative politicians and business leaders thought they could harness Hitler's mass support while keeping him under control. Their fear of the left and hunger for power led them to invite him into the chancellorship and support measures like the Enabling Act. 7. Legal revolution from within. Hitler did not abolish the Constitution in a single stroke. Instead, he used emergency decrees, laws passed by Parliament, and the outward forms of legality to hollow out the system until almost nothing was left. None of these factors alone explains Hitler's rise. Together, they created a path by which an extremist movement, openly preaching hatred and violence, could move from the fringe to the center and then close the door behind it. A warning in the ledger. If you leaf through the records of those years, election tables, parliamentary debates, decrees, and laws, nothing looks magical. There are no flashing signs announcing the end of democracy. Just votes, speeches, bargains, signatures. That may be the most unsettling part. A significant portion of the German population supported Hitler enthusiastically. Another portion opposed him and paid dearly. Many more adapted, looked away, or told themselves that things would settle down, that someone else would draw a line. History remembers where that path led to a regime that unleashed war, genocide, and destruction on a scale that remade the world. When I returned that old ballot paper to its folder, it sits quietly in the archive, alongside many other records of ordinary decisions made in extraordinary times. The story of Hitler's rise is not only about the man at the center, but about the society around him, the crises, the fears, the institutions, and the choices. That is why it still matters, and why we keep opening these pages. If you'd like, in another chapter, we can linger over any part of this story, the inner workings of Weimar politics, the Nazi propaganda machine, or the making of the Enabling Act, and examine it in closer detail.